The shocking revelation. The morning sunlight filtered through the tall courthouse windows, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floors of Courtroom 7. Judge Mark Bennett adjusted his black robes, the fabric draping over his shoulders as he strode toward the bench. His footsteps echoed through the hushed chamber, a rhythmic tap against the solemn air. He had presided over hundreds of cases, seen criminals plead for mercy, families torn apart, and justice served, but today, he had no idea his entire world was about to change. "All rise," the bailiff's voice boomed through the courtroom. The Honorable Judge Mark Bennett presiding. Mark settled into his high-backed chair, the leather creaking softly beneath him. He automatically adjusted the stack of files before him, a practiced motion that had become second nature over the years. The familiarity of routine comforted him, grounding him in the reality of his profession. Justice was not always easy, but it was his duty, a duty he carried with unwavering commitment. As he glanced up to begin the morning's proceedings, his gaze swept across the courtroom, landing on the plaintiff's table. There, standing beside a young girl, was a woman who made his breath catch in his throat. Hannah Carter. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. His fingers tightened slightly around the gavel as recognition washed over him like a tidal wave. It had been over a decade since he had last seen her, since their fleeting, passionate romance had come to an abrupt end. She looked different now, more tired, more fragile. Her once bright green eyes were now shadowed with something that made his stomach tighten. Fear? Sadness? But it was the girl standing beside her that truly unsettled him. A young child, no older than 10, with dark brown hair and large, intelligent eyes that bore an uncanny resemblance to his own. The way she stared at him, curious, expectant, almost knowing, made his pulse quicken. Mark forced himself to focus, shoving his emotions aside. This was a courtroom, not a reunion. He cleared his throat. "State the case before us," he said, keeping his voice steady. The opposing attorney rose. "Your Honor, we are here today regarding the guardianship of Miss Lily Carter. Her mother, Hannah Carter, has filed for sole legal guardianship and a modification of support due to unforeseen circumstances." Mark barely heard the words. His attention was riveted on the child. Lily Carter. Carter. The name was not unfamiliar, but it wasn't what sent a chill down his spine. It was something deeper, an instinct, a gnawing sensation in his gut that he couldn't ignore. The attorney continued, flipping through his notes. "Ms. Carter has also requested to speak directly to the court regarding a personal matter." Hannah shifted in her seat, her hands trembling slightly. She looked up at him then, her gaze searching his face for something, recognition, maybe. Mark exhaled slowly, forcing professionalism into his tone. "Ms. Carter, you may proceed." Hannah swallowed hard, then turned to the young girl beside her. She reached out, squeezing the child's hand, then nodded toward her. "Lily," she said softly, "tell the judge what you told me." The little girl hesitated, shifting nervously from foot to foot. Then, with surprising courage, she stepped forward and looked Mark directly in the eye. The courtroom fell silent. "Mom says you're my daddy." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. The gavel slipped from Mark's grip, landing on the bench with a dull thud. His heart pounded violently in his chest as the weight of those words crashed over him. A stunned murmur spread through the courtroom, but Mark barely heard it. His vision blurred at the edges as he stared at the child, his child. His throat felt tight. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. Hannah looked away, guilt and pain written all over her face. Mark gripped the edges of his bench, trying to steady himself. His mind reeled, flashing back to the past. Their affair had been brief but intense, filled with youthful passion and whispered promises that had eventually faded. He had never known, never even suspected, that she had been carrying his child when she walked away. His gaze snapped back to Lily, who was still standing there, waiting for him to say something. Anything. He exhaled sharply. Miss Carter, he said, his voice betraying none of the storm raging inside him. Is this true? Hannah nodded slowly, her lips pressed together. Yes. A muscle tightened in Mark's jaw. And you never told me? I had my reasons, she whispered. Anger and confusion swirled in his chest, but there was no time for that now. He was a judge, he had to remain composed. He had to process this in a way that wouldn't derail the hearing. His hands curled into fists beneath the bench as he forced himself to focus. What is the nature of this case? Why are we here? Hannah took a deep breath, her voice trembling. I'm dying, Mark. The courtroom went deathly silent once more. Mark felt the air leave his lungs. Hannah continued, tears welling in her eyes. I have terminal cancer. I don't have much time left. I can't, her voice cracked, and she pressed a hand to her mouth, composing herself. I can't leave Lily without a parent. She needs you. Mark's world tilted. His heart thundered in his ears. This wasn't just about an old love affair or the sudden revelation of a daughter he had never known. This was about a little girl who was about to lose everything, and a mother's last desperate plea for help. He glanced at Lily again. She was watching him, her tiny hands clenched at her sides, her eyes filled with something that shattered him completely. Hope. A hope he wasn't sure he deserved. Mark swallowed hard. For the first time in his career, he felt truly unprepared for the weight of what lay before him. The woman he once loved was dying. And the daughter he never knew existed was looking at him, waiting for him to decide her fate. And for the first time in his life, Judge Mark Bennett didn't know what to do, the weight of truth. The courtroom remained silent, the weight of Hannah's words hanging in the air like an impending storm. Judge Mark Bennett felt as if the very ground beneath him had shifted. The woman he once loved, the woman he had thought was nothing more than a fleeting memory, was standing before him, her body frail, her eyes filled with unspoken pain. And beside her stood a little girl, 10 years old, with eyes that mirrored his own, a child who had just called him daddy. A child he had never known existed. His pulse roared in his ears. He had faced murderers, high-profile criminals, and intense legal battles in his career, yet nothing had ever shaken him like this. Mark gripped the arms of his chair, struggling to keep his emotions in check. Miss Carter, his voice was rougher than he intended. He swallowed, trying again. Hannah, why? Why didn't you tell me? Hannah lowered her gaze, fingers twisting the fabric of her blouse. I was scared, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Back then, we were both young, and you were just starting your career. I didn't want to hold you back, and honestly, I didn't know if you'd want a child. A mix of anger, confusion, and something raw burned in his chest. You took that decision away from me. Tears glistened in her eyes, but she nodded. I did. And I regret it. But I can't change the past, Mark. All I can do now is try to fix the future, for Lily. Lily. His eyes flickered to the girl, standing silently, her small hands gripping the hem of her dress. There was so much in her gaze, fear, uncertainty, hope. Mark exhaled, pressing his fingers against his temples. He needed a moment to think, but the courtroom didn't wait for emotions. He had a case to preside over. He straightened in his chair. I need more information. What exactly are you asking the court for today? Hannah inhaled shakily and turned to her attorney. The lawyer, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes, stepped forward. Your Honor, Miss Carter is seeking an expedited legal transfer of guardianship for Lily Carter. She wishes to ensure that Lily has a secure home before her passing. Mark's stomach clenched at the word passing. His mind screamed in denial, but the lawyer continued. Miss Carter's medical reports indicate that she has less than 6 months to live. She is undergoing treatment, but the reality is that she may not be able to care for Lily much longer. Given the circumstances, she is requesting that the biological father, Judge Bennett, be granted full guardianship upon her passing. The air in the room felt suffocating. Mark opened his mouth, then closed it. The words refused to come. This wasn't just about acknowledging the past. This was about his entire future being rewritten in the span of a few minutes. He had never considered fatherhood. His life had been meticulously planned: law school, judgeship, years of carefully crafting a career built on logic and order. And now, fate had thrown him a curveball in the form of a 10-year-old girl with his eyes and a mother who was running out of time. His mind raced. Guardianship. That wasn't something to take lightly. A child wasn't a legal case, she was a person, a responsibility. Could he do this? Did he even have the right to? His voice came out lower than before. What about other relatives? Grandparents? Aunts? Uncles? Hannah shook her head. My parents passed years ago. I have no siblings. There's no one else, Mark. Just you. Just him. He inhaled deeply. Does Lily? His throat tightened. He wasn't sure how to phrase the question. Does she understand what's happening? Lily lifted her head at the mention of her name. Her gaze was sharp, perceptive in a way that made her seem older than her years. I know my mom is sick, she said softly. I know she won't be here forever. Mark's heart clenched. Lily took a step forward, her small hands tightening into fists at her sides. Mom told me about you a few weeks ago, she said. She said she wanted me to meet you because, her voice wavered, but she took a steadying breath. Because she didn't want me to be alone. The words hit him like a punch to the gut. Lily's lower lip trembled. Are you mad at her? She asked quietly. Mark stared at the little girl standing in front of him, so vulnerable yet so brave. His emotions warred within him: anger, sadness, guilt. But most of all, an overwhelming sense of responsibility. No, he said finally. I'm not mad. Lily's shoulders relaxed slightly, but the uncertainty in her eyes remained. The opposing attorney cleared his throat. Your Honor, we understand this is an unexpected situation for you. However, given Ms. Carter's condition, we are asking for an emergency hearing to determine a legal guardian for Lily before it's too late. Ms. Carter would like Judge Bennett to consider his role in Lily's life. Mark sat motionless, his mind spinning. A judge was expected to be impartial, to look at facts and render decisions based on the law. But this case was different, this was personal. He could feel the weight of every set of eyes in the courtroom on him, waiting. Expecting. He glanced at Hannah again. She was watching him, her face lined with exhaustion but also hope. A plea, unspoken but clear. And then there was Lily, this little girl who had just learned she had a father, looking at him with a mixture of fear and longing. Mark's hands trembled slightly as he gripped the arms of his chair. He had no idea how to be a father. He had no idea if he could be what Lily needed. But one thing was clear. He couldn't walk away. He cleared his throat, forcing the tremor out of his voice. I will need to review the documents, including the medical reports and any legal proceedings regarding Lily's custody. Until then, I want to speak with Ms. Carter and Lily privately. Hannah exhaled a shaky breath, relief evident on her face. The bailiff nodded. Court is adjourned. The sound of the gavel echoed through the room. As people began to shuffle out, Mark remained seated, staring at the little girl who had just changed his life forever. Lily hesitated, then took a small step toward him. If I come live with you, will I have my own room? Her voice was so soft, so uncertain, and something inside Mark cracked. He exhaled. Of course, you will. A small, tentative smile flickered across her face. And in that moment, Mark realized something. Whether he was ready or not, he had just taken his first step toward becoming a father. A father's first step. Judge Mark Bennett sat motionless in his chair, the echoes of the gavel still ringing in his ears. The courtroom was empty now, save for Hannah, Lily, and himself. The polished wooden floors gleamed under the afternoon sunlight, but the warmth did nothing to ease the chill settling deep in his bones. His world had shifted, and he wasn't sure he'd ever find solid ground again. Lily stood a few feet away, small hands gripping the hem of her dress, her gaze darting between him and her mother. Mark's throat tightened at the uncertainty in her expression. She wasn't just a name on a legal document anymore. She was real. His daughter. A child who had just learned she had a father. A child who might lose her mother any day now. He drew a slow breath. He had to handle this carefully. "Let's talk," he said finally, rising from his seat. He gestured toward his private chambers. "Somewhere quieter." Hannah nodded, her movements slow, as though even standing was an effort. Lily looked to her mother for reassurance before hesitantly following. Mark led them down a hallway lined with framed legal documents and old photos, his steps slower than usual. His private chambers were an extension of himself, orderly, professional. A dark mahogany desk sat in the center, stacks of neatly arranged case files covering its surface. Bookshelves lined the walls, their contents meticulously arranged, and a single, untouched armchair stood near the window. He gestured for them to sit, taking the chair behind his desk. For a long moment, no one spoke. Hannah exhaled heavily. "I know this is a lot, Mark. I wouldn't have brought this to you if I had any other choice." Mark's jaw clenched. "You always had a choice," he said quietly. Hannah flinched. "You're right," she admitted. "And I made the wrong one." Silence settled between them. Lily looked between the two adults, her small fingers nervously fidgeting with the sleeve of her sweater. She was trying to be strong, but Mark could see the cracks forming in her composure. He leaned forward, directing his focus to her. "Lily," he said gently, "tell me about yourself." She blinked, seemingly surprised by the question. "Like what?" "Anything you want. What do you like to do?" Lily hesitated, then straightened a little. "I like to read," she said quietly. "Mystery books. The ones where you have to figure out who did it." Mark felt a flicker of something he couldn't quite place. "Good choice. I used to love those when I was your age." Her eyes widened slightly. "You did?" He nodded. "I still do. You'd be surprised how much of my job is like solving a mystery." Lily gave him a small, uncertain smile, and something inside him eased. He wasn't sure what he had expected from this conversation, but he hadn't realized how much he wanted to see her smile again. Hannah cleared her throat softly. "Lily, why don't you go pick a book from the shelf? I need to talk to Mark alone." Lily hesitated, glancing at him for approval. He nodded, and she slid off her chair, walking toward the bookshelf with quiet steps. As soon as she was out of earshot, Hannah's expression shifted, her exhaustion more evident than ever. "I don't have much time left," she admitted. "The doctors said 6 months was an optimistic estimate." Mark's stomach twisted. "I've been preparing her," she continued, her voice unsteady. "As best as I can. But how do you prepare a child for something like this?" There was no answer to that. She leaned forward. "Mark, I need to know if you're going to do this. If you're going to be there for her." His chest tightened. He had spent his entire career making decisions, delivering verdicts that changed lives. But this wasn't a courtroom. There were no laws, no precedents to follow, just a little girl who needed him, and a woman who was running out of time. "I don't know how to be a father," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Hannah gave him a tired smile. "No one does," not at first. But Lily doesn't need perfection. She just needs someone to show up. Someone who won't leave her. Mark looked away. The weight of that responsibility felt heavier than anything he had ever carried. "I need time," he finally said. Hannah nodded, but her eyes told him what her voice did not. "You don't have much of that." A small voice interrupted their conversation. "Mom?" Lily stood near the bookshelf, a book clutched to her chest. But her gaze wasn't on her mother, it was on Mark. "Can I ask you something?" she said hesitantly. Mark nodded. "Of course." Lily shifted on her feet, looking down at the book in her hands. "If I come live with you, will you still let me talk about Mom?" Mark's breath caught in his throat. Hannah turned away slightly, pressing her fingers to her lips as she fought back tears. Mark leaned forward, keeping his gaze steady. "Lily, your mom will always be a part of your life. Nothing will ever change that." She studied him, as if measuring the truth in his words. Then she nodded, gripping the book tighter. And for the first time, Mark knew. He had already made his decision. Maybe he wasn't ready. Maybe he would never be. But he would not let this little girl go through life alone. He would be there. No matter what. A decision that changes everything. Mark sat in silence long after Hannah and Lily left his chambers. His hands were still resting on the desk, fingers pressed against the smooth wood, but his mind was in turmoil. A daughter. He had a daughter. The reality still felt too large to grasp. He wasn't just being asked to acknowledge her existence, he was being asked to step up, to become something he had never been, a father. Could he do that? Could he erase a decade of absence in the short time that Hannah had left? The thought made his stomach twist. With a heavy sigh, he pushed back from the desk and rubbed a hand over his face. He needed answers, not emotions. He needed to understand what Lily's life had been like without him. He reached for his phone and dialed a number before he could talk himself out of it. Detective Kessler. Mark leaned back in his chair. "Kessler, it's Bennett. I need a favor." The detective let out a low chuckle. "You, asking for a favor? That's a first. What's the case?" Mark hesitated, staring at the framed degrees on his wall, the evidence of a life built on certainty and control. "It's personal. I need information on Hannah Carter. Medical history, financials, where she's been the last 10 years. And, I need everything you can find on her daughter, Lily." There was a pause. "You sure about this, Judge?" No. He wasn't sure about any of it. But he had to be. "Yes. I'll get back to you," Kessler said before hanging up. Mark exhaled, tapping his fingers against the desk. He needed time to process, but time wasn't a luxury he had. Meeting Lily, the right way. That evening, Mark found himself parked outside a small, weathered apartment complex on the other side of town. It was a world apart from his own, a far cry from the pristine neighborhoods judges were expected to live in. The brick exterior was cracked, the front steps uneven. It was clear Hannah had been surviving, not thriving. He had called ahead, letting Hannah know he wanted to talk. Not as a judge. Not in a courtroom. Just as a man trying to understand the daughter he had never known. He knocked twice, the door opening a moment later. Hannah looked paler than she had earlier that day. The exhaustion was etched into her features, the fight against her illness written in the way she held herself up. "You came," she said softly. Mark nodded. "I needed to." She stepped aside, allowing him in. The apartment was small but warm. The walls were lined with bookshelves, children's drawings pinned up like artwork. A stuffed rabbit sat on the couch, worn with age. "She's in her room," Hannah said. "I told her you'd be stopping by." Mark felt something tighten in his chest. He had never been nervous in a courtroom, but standing outside his daughter's bedroom door? That terrified him. He knocked lightly. "Lily?" A small voice responded. "Come in." Mark stepped inside, taking in the space. The room was modest, a single bed with colorful sheets, stacks of books piled near a tiny desk, and a telescope pointed toward the window. Lily sat on the bed, hugging her stuffed rabbit close. She looked at him, hesitant but expectant. Mark cleared his throat. I like your room." She nodded. "Thanks." An awkward silence stretched between them. He had no idea how to talk to a child. Especially his child. Finally, Lily broke the silence. "Are you really a judge?" Mark smiled slightly. "I am." "So you put bad guys in jail?" "Sometimes," he said. "Mostly, I just try to make sure people get treated fairly." Lily tilted her head. "Is it fair that I didn't know about you?" Mark sucked in a breath. She was sharp. He had expected hesitation, even shyness, but not this direct honesty. "No," he admitted. "It's not." She nodded, as if satisfied with his answer. "Mom said you're really smart." Mark chuckled. "She said that, did she?" Lily shrugged. "She said you always know what to do." Mark's smile faded. "Not always." Another silence. Then Lily reached down and picked up a book from her bed. "Mom's too tired to read to me now," she said quietly. "Can you?" Mark hesitated for only a moment before taking the book. It was a well-worn copy of The Secret Garden. He sat down on the edge of the bed, flipping to the marked page. And as he began to read, something inside him shifted. Lily curled up under the blanket, listening intently, and for the first time, it felt real. Not a courtroom battle, not a legal dilemma, just a father reading to his daughter. When he finished the chapter, he glanced over and found her fast asleep, her small hand gripping the edge of his sleeve. A lump formed in his throat. He wasn't ready for this. But ready or not, Lily needed him. And he wasn't going to walk away. A silent goodbye. Hannah stood in the doorway, watching. "She likes you," she whispered as Mark carefully pulled his sleeve from Lily's grasp. Mark sighed. "I don't know if I deserve that." Hannah smiled weakly. "It's not about deserving, Mark. It's about showing up." He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the truth beneath the brave facade. She was slipping away. "She needs you," Hannah continued. "And when I'm gone, I need to know she'll be okay." Mark clenched his jaw. He didn't have all the answers. He didn't know how to be a father, how to navigate this sudden upheaval in his life. But as he stood there, watching his sleeping daughter, he made a silent vow. He would not let her face this world alone. No matter what, learning to be a father. Mark sat in his car outside Hannah's apartment, staring at the steering wheel. He had just stepped into a world he didn't know how to navigate. Being a judge came with clear rules, guidelines, and precedents. But this? This was uncharted territory. Lily had fallen asleep listening to his voice. A child he didn't even know a day ago now felt like a fragile thread tying him to something he never thought he'd have, a family. And Hannah, she was slipping away. His fingers tightened around the wheel. This wasn't just about stepping up. It was about making sure Lily didn't feel abandoned, not by her mother, and certainly not by him. Seeking guidance. The next morning, Mark found himself sitting in his brother's diner. The smell of fresh coffee and sizzling bacon filled the air, but he had no appetite. Across from him, his younger brother, James, sipped his coffee, watching him carefully. "So, let me get this straight," James said. "You find out you have a kid, and now you're planning to become a full-time dad overnight?" Mark rubbed a hand over his face. I don't know what I'm doing, James. James chuckled. Yeah, no kidding. Mark shot him a glare, but his brother only smirked. James had always been the opposite of him, carefree, easygoing. He owned this little diner, lived life without structure, while Mark had built his world around control and precision. And now? That control was slipping. Mark exhaled. How do you know what to do with kids? James raised an eyebrow. I don't know, man. You just do it. You show up, you listen, and you don't run when it gets hard. Mark frowned. That's it? James nodded. That's it. Kids don't need a perfect parent. They need someone who's there. Mark leaned back in his chair, digesting his brother's words. It wasn't about being perfect. It was about showing up. Maybe he could do that. Taking the first step. Later that evening, Mark found himself knocking on Hannah's apartment door once again. This time, when she opened it, he wasn't there as a judge. He was there as a father. Hannah gave him a tired smile. You came back. Mark nodded. Yeah. And I plan to keep coming back. Her shoulders relaxed. Lily's in her room. Mark hesitated. Actually, I wanted to talk to you first. She led him to the small kitchen table, and they sat across from each other. The dim light highlighted the hollowness in her cheeks, the quiet exhaustion in her eyes. Mark cleared his throat. I've been thinking a lot. About what you said. About what Lily needs. Hannah remained silent, watching him carefully. I want to be in her life, Mark continued. But I don't just want to take over when you're gone. I want to start now. A flicker of relief crossed Hannah's face. I was hoping you'd say that. I don't know what I'm doing, he admitted. But I want to try. Hannah smiled softly. That's all she needs. A new routine. Over the next few weeks, Mark became a regular presence in Lily's life. At first, she was cautious. She'd watch him carefully, unsure of what to expect. But slowly, she started letting him in. They found a rhythm. He'd pick her up from school when Hannah was too tired. He helped her with her homework, even though she was already smarter than most kids her age. And at night, before bed, he'd read to her. That became their thing. One night, as he was finishing The Secret Garden, Lily looked up at him with wide eyes. Are you gonna be here every night? Mark hesitated, then nodded. As many nights as I can. A small smile tugged at her lips. Good. She didn't need grand promises. She just needed to know he wasn't going anywhere. A hard reality. But as the weeks passed, Hannah's condition worsened. There were days she could barely get out of bed. Days when Lily clung to her, fear evident in her tiny hands gripping her mother's arm. One evening, after putting Lily to bed, Mark found Hannah sitting on the couch, staring at the ceiling. She turned to him, her voice barely a whisper. It's happening faster than I thought. Mark swallowed hard. Have you told her? Hannah shook her head. Not the way I need to. Mark sat beside her, the weight of their reality pressing down. I don't know how to say goodbye to her, she admitted. Mark looked at her, this woman he once loved, the mother of his child, the person who had carried this burden alone for so long. You don't have to do it alone, he said quietly. Hannah looked at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. Thank you. For the first time in years, they weren't two people with a broken past. They were two parents, doing the best they could. A promise kept. The night before Hannah was admitted to hospice, she called Mark into her room. I need you to promise me something, she said, her voice weak but steady. Mark nodded, taking her frail hand in his. Anything. She took a shaky breath. When I'm gone, don't let her think she's alone. Don't let her think she lost everything. Mark's chest tightened. I won't. Tears slipped down her cheeks. She's going to need you, Mark. I know, he whispered. She squeezed his hand. Then promise me you'll be the father she deserves. Mark felt the weight of those words settle deep in his soul. I promise. Saying goodbye and embracing the future. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of fresh rain and blooming flowers. The hospital hallways were too quiet, the kind of silence that pressed against the chest like an invisible weight. Mark walked down the corridor, his step steady but his heart heavy. He had been here before, standing in cold, sterile rooms, watching families say their final goodbyes. But this time was different. This time, it was personal. Hannah's condition had worsened overnight. The doctors said it wouldn't be long now. As he reached her room, he found Lily sitting by her mother's bedside, her tiny hands curled around Hannah's frail fingers. The sight nearly broke him. Hannah's breathing was shallow, her face pale, but when she opened her eyes and saw him, she managed a small, tired smile. You came, she whispered. Mark stepped closer, nodding. Of course, I did. Lily looked up at him, her eyes red and swollen from crying. She's really sick, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, as if saying it out loud would make it more real. Mark crouched beside her, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. I know, sweetheart. Hannah's fingers twitched in Lily's grasp. Come here, she murmured, her gaze locked on her daughter's face. Lily hesitated before climbing onto the bed, curling up beside her mother like she had done so many times before. Do you remember what I told you about the stars? Hannah asked softly. Lily nodded, her small hands gripping the fabric of her mother's hospital gown. You said that when people leave, they don't really go away. They become stars so we can always find them. Hannah smiled weakly. That's right. And one day, when you look up at the night sky, I want you to find the brightest one and know that I'm still with you. Tears slipped down Lily's cheeks as she buried her face against her mother's chest. I don't want you to go. Mark closed his eyes, fighting back the lump in his throat. Hannah lifted a trembling hand, brushing Lily's hair back. I know, baby. But I need you to be brave, okay? You're going to be okay. You have your dad now. Lily turned, her wet eyes locking onto Mark's. You won't leave, right? The question hit him like a punch to the gut. He leaned in, cupping her small face in his hands. Never, he promised. I'll always be here. Lily sniffled and nodded, as if she wanted to believe him but wasn't sure how. Hannah's breathing grew slower, weaker. She turned to Mark, her eyes filled with unspoken words. Take care of her. Mark squeezed her hand. I will. She gave him a tired, grateful smile before closing her eyes. A few moments later, the monitors flatlined. And just like that, she was gone. Lily let out a quiet sob, gripping her mother's hand tighter. Mark pulled her into his arms, holding her close as she cried against his chest. I've got you, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. You're not alone. And for the first time, Lily let herself believe him. Adjusting to a new life. The funeral was small and quiet. Mark made sure every detail was taken care of, ensuring that Hannah was laid to rest with dignity and love. Lily barely spoke during the service, her tiny hand never leaving Mark's. That night, as they returned to Mark's house, their house, Lily stood in the doorway, looking around. This is big, she said softly. Mark chuckled. Yeah. A little different from what you're used to, huh? She nodded, shifting on her feet. Where's my room? Mark smiled and held out his hand. Come on, I'll show you. He led her down the hallway to a freshly prepared bedroom. It wasn't much yet, just a bed, a small desk, and a bookshelf, but he had done his best to make it feel welcoming. "I know it's not home yet," he said. "But we can make it yours." Lily stepped inside, running her fingers over the bookshelf. "You got me books?" Mark nodded. "I wasn't sure what you'd like, so I got a mix." She turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "Are you sure you want me here?" The question nearly broke him. He crouched down to her level, taking her small hands in his. "Lily, listen to me. This is your home now. I want you here more than anything." She studied him for a long moment before whispering, "Okay." It wasn't an immediate acceptance. It wasn't a grand, tearful moment. But it was a start. Building a family. The next few weeks were an adjustment for both of them. Mark learned that Lily hated mornings but loved pancakes. He learned that she talked to her stuffed rabbit, Mr. Buttons, whenever she was nervous. And Lily learned that Mark was a terrible cook but a pretty good storyteller. They navigated school drop-offs, bedtime routines, and tough nights when grief hit hard. One evening, after another long day, Lily hesitated at the door of Mark's office. "Can I sit with you?" she asked softly. Mark smiled and patted the chair beside him. "Of course." She curled up in the chair, watching as he worked through legal documents. After a while, she spoke. "Do you think Mom's really up there?" Mark set his pen down and turned to face her. "I do." Lily nodded thoughtfully. "I think she'd be happy that we found each other." Mark swallowed the lump in his throat. "I think so too." She hesitated, then reached over, slipping her small hand into his. And in that moment, he knew. They were going to be okay. They weren't just a judge and a little girl who had lost her mother. They were a family. And that was all that mattered.